Yá'át'ééh. Good morning, my relatives. Today is Tuesday, February 19th, and I'm sitting here with my second cup of coffee. And I'm looking forward to having a discussion with you about my ongoing process to decolonize my health. So, if you've been following me on social media or on my podcast, you know that over the past year and a half, I've been working very hard to get my body back into a healthy state. I had my hip replaced about a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now. And since then, I've lost over 50 pounds and I've radically changed not just my weight, but all of my health. And I've been very intentional about this process, and I've been kind of tracking it and even talking about it more publicly in some of my talks and my speeches when I talk about decolonizing health. I'm actually now telling people I'm officially writing a third book. I decided to take the stuff I've been learning and the content I've been discussing and start putting into the shape of a book that I'm going to publish, hopefully after I finish Decolonizing Faith. I want to do this next book that I will call Decolonizing Health, and looking at the ways that our colonial lifestyles, our colonial values as a nation and as a society have radically hampered and caused health, especially our chronic health problems that we're facing as a nation. And how, if we'd have just listened to the indigenous wisdoms of the hosts of Turtle Islands when people first arrived here, when Westerners first arrived here, things would have been so much better. But anyway, that's the discussion for today. I'm going to talk about some books I've been reading regarding that, and we'll have a good discussion about that. But before I begin, I want to do like I always do and acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from what's now called Washington, D.C., and these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. I want to honor the Piscataway as the host people of the lands where I'm living. I want to thank the Piscataway for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state how humbling it is and how humbled I am to be living, moving, breathing, living on these lands today. So, Yá'át'ééh, my Piscataway relatives, thank you for your stewardship of these lands. Let me see who's online with me this morning. I know there's a few people on there. Yá'át'ééh, grab your favorite morning beverage. I have my second cup of coffee of the day, and I'm looking forward to sharing some thoughts with you. Mr. Phil Fox, Yá'át'ééh, good to have you here. So grateful that you can join this morning from the land of the Anishinaabe and the Potawatomi. I'm actually going to be traveling to that area of Michigan coming up in April. I will be speaking in some classes at the University of Michigan on April 10th. And I'm working hard now to begin scheduling some other events in the area while I'm going to be there. Hopefully, mostly in the Detroit area, but I'm also willing to look at some possible venues in Grand Rapids, Michigan as well, which is kind of on the other side of the state, but would look forward to getting out there at some point. Anyway, so thank you, Mr. Phil Fox, for joining me this morning. It's good to have you and all the others who are on with me. Yá'át'ééh, Donna, thank you for joining. It's good to have you here. I appreciate all of you getting up and starting your day. I'm doing my second cup of coffee on Tuesday this week instead of on Thursday or Friday because I'm going to be traveling this week. I'm not speaking, but I'm going to be traveling to New Mexico. I am going to go spend a few days, a day with my parents and see some relatives up there. And my daughter is going with me. She's on a winter break right now, and our son is going to meet us there. We're actually going to meet my cousin there and go skiing in southern Colorado for a day. And we're going to enjoy some skiing that my daughter and I went last year and had such a great time at Purgatory up near Durango, Colorado. And we decided to go back this year. And my son, who has not been skiing before this year, decided to join us this year. So I'm looking forward to spending some time with my kids and spending a day skiing on the mountains in southern Colorado. And also will take some time to see my family and some other friends and relatives in the New Mexico area while I'm in that area. Both we'll be in New Mexico mostly, but the ski resort's right up in southern Colorado. So we'll just cross over the state line and go skiing and then come back down to New Mexico. But anyway, I wanted to talk to you about some of the books I've been reading this year. Just a few weeks ago, early in January, I did my top 12 books of 2024. And I've been continuing my frenzy of reading going into 2025. Just to give you a few ideas of the books I've read this month, I've read The Year of Less by Kate Flanders. I've read The Story of the Human Body by Daniel Lieberman. I've read Rethinking Diabetes by Gary Taubes. I've read The Comfort Crisis by Michael Eastern. I've started The Omnivore's Dilemma and The Dorito Effect. The Omnivore's Dilemma is by Michael Pollan. The Dorito Effect is by Mark Schatzker. I've also read a book called The Magic Pill by Johann Hari and In Defense of Food, which I am nearly finished with right now, also by Michael Pollan. And then The End of Craving by Mark Schatzker. And if you remember the conversation I've been having, so just to walk it back a little bit, about a year and a half ago, almost 20 months ago, I had my hip replaced and I decided I was going to radically change my health. My BMI, which is not the best measure of body mass and weight especially for people of color, is primarily a measure that's been developed and used on, both tested on and kind of the standards set by white people, and not taking into account the different body shapes and sizes of different ethnic groups and people who are not white. But it's one of the measures that's used fairly frequently. And according to my BMI, even a year and a half ago, I was in the obese category. And my blood sugars were high, and I was not doing well. I wasn't able to move well because of my hip replacement. And I missed some opportunities to play basketball with my daughters during COVID when they both wanted to learn how to play basketball. And so when I got my hip replaced, I decided I really no longer wanted to take my health for granted. And I wanted to get my body into better shape and to change my health radically. And over the past year and a half, I've done that. Not only have I lost 50 pounds, over 50 pounds, I'm nearly lost about 55 pounds over the past year and a half, but I've radically changed all the measures of my health. My blood sugar is back in the normal range. All of my measures, almost all of my measures are back into a very healthy range again. My sleep has increased by over almost an hour in the past year and a half, an hour a night. My circadian rhythm has improved. My eating habits have improved. I've radically changed my diet. I've radically changed my movement, and I've done a lot of things. And as you can tell, as I've been going through this process, I've read a ton of books, right? A lot of the books that I read last year that I even reviewed and were some of my top books were almost all books about health and about ways to move better, to eat better, to think about food better, to think about health better. And as I was going through all of these books, all the books, they had their one thing, right? Every author had their one thing. The 5 a.m. club talked about you need to do these 3 things every morning. People like Gary Taubes is like, if you just cut out carbs, you'll be able to do this. People look at other things. If you just drop your seed oils, if you just eat more of this or eat less of that, or move in this way or do this sort of thing, you'll be beautiful, you'll be prosperous, and you'll live till you're 105, right? And of course, they're all not right, but nor are they all wrong. And as you're going through these books, I realize you need some kind of a filter to okay, what's over the top, what's too much, what's not enough? How do I filter all of this information? I also read a book by Marianne Kimmerer, who called Braiding Sweetgrass. And she is a botanist and talked about the need to counter in Western science with indigenous wisdom. Not throw out Western science, but Western science needs a counterbalance of indigenous wisdom. And she gave several examples of where Western science is just barely now beginning to catch up with what indigenous peoples have known and taught and understood for hundreds, even thousands of years. And I actually had a podcast last year where I looked at the distinction between Western science and indigenous wisdom. And I realized as I was reading through these books, the filter I was using more and more was how did my indigenous peoples live? How did my Navajo people live? How did they eat? How did they move? What did we move and live like when we were living in the Hogan? What are the values taught in our stories? And I began to use that indigenous wisdom as my filter as I was trying to make sense of all this scientific data, which changes daily, right? I mean, it literally, yesterday you could eat eggs, today you can't. One day you can drink wine, the next day you can't. One day you can eat carbs, the next day you can't eat carbs. One day you have to go low fat, the next day you can eat all the fat you want. I mean, it's constantly changing because, and I've shared this quote before, I'm going to share it once again, because as Katie Bowman in her book Movement Matters, and was my top book of last year, but the quote she gave that I've used over and over and over again in this book, she said, I would suggest that a group of humans have never been this sedentary and survived. We, Western culture, citizens of the United States, have no idea how to move. And so we are turning to science to show us. P.S. That's not science's role at all, but when you have an elder-free society, you have to turn somewhere, and scientific data is where many of us are turning. In that essay that she's writing about in that book, she talks about the challenges of Western science in that it's reductionary. And science reduces things. So if you want to become a doctor, you study first biology, and then you study human anatomy, and then you study a certain part of the body, and then you specialize into one aspect and one organ, and before long you are the expert of the left frontal quadrant of the pancreas, and you're like, that's your thing that you do and talk about all the time. And that's a great way to understand how something works. But the body doesn't work as a bunch of individual organs that each just do their own thing. They communicate, they work back and forth, they work in conjunction with one another. It's not even a machine that you can just swap out parts. It's a human living organism that has evolved and been designed to work and grow together. And when you study it by reducing down to a single component, you may understand what that single component is, but you have very little understanding of how that works within the wholeness of the entire body, whether it's movement, whether it's diet, whether it's nutrition, whether it's eating. And so this is why our science is always changing, right? Because we're learning about it by reducing it down to the smallest component. And very few people are looking at it in a holistic way of how does this all work together. Indigenous wisdom, we didn't have the technology to look at these tiny little components, but we were very observant and had a very good understanding of how these things work together. And so when Western Europeans came here and discovered these lands, dehumanizing the people who had already lived here and thinking we had nothing of value to give them or to show them, right? They never bothered to ask us, what does it mean to live here well? How do you eat? How do you move? How do you live sustainably within these lands and with this place? And because of that, they threw everything we knew out, including us, and started trying to piece things together through their reductionist scientific data, which, as Katie Bowman points out, is in its infancy. And so I realized as I was going through this process, I wasn't just getting healthier. I was literally beginning to counter the colonial values and patterns and lifestyle that I was taught growing up in this country. And I realized I was doing a process of decolonizing myself. How I ate, how I moved, how I slept, the rhythms of my day and of my body and of my week and of my year. And that's when I started talking about I'm decolonizing my health. And as I read more books and pieced more things together, and especially looked more at Indigenous wisdom and things that Indigenous peoples knew and understood long before Columbus was lost at sea, I came to the conclusion, I think I need to write another book. I'm already working on the book called Decolonizing Faith. Now I'm fully just acknowledging I'm not writing it yet, but I'm gathering content and I'm collecting my thoughts for a third book that I will call Decolonizing Health. I've already begun talking about it. I've given several presentations on it around the country as I've spoken in different places. There's several things online. I'll share some of them in the notes for this video. But yeah, it's been something I've been working on and thinking through for a long time. And so what I want to talk to you about today are three of the books that I've read most recently. And I'm going to give you the covers of these books here. The first book I want to talk about briefly is The Magic Pill, The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs by Johann Hari. And then I want to talk a little bit about a book I'm almost done with, but I love this book, In Defense of Food by Michael Pollan. And then I want to talk about a book I read about a month ago. This was in January, called The End of Craving by Mark Schatzker. I hope I'm saying his name right. And this was a paradigm shifting book for me. So I want to end by talking about that. But first, I want to start by jumping in and just talking. Let's talk about the book. Well, let's go back and talk about this book, The Magic Pill. This book, I wasn't even sure why I wanted to read it. It came across me. I read a lot of books now, and when I say read, I listen to. I love Audible books. I love being able to listen to books while I'm walking, while I'm driving, while I'm waking up or winding down in the morning. And as you can already say, I've read about 7 or 8 books already this year. I can really power through books very quickly this way. And I listen to them on Audible. I listen to them on Libby. I listen to them on Spotify. And it's a great way to digest information and continue learning this process. And so I listened to this book, The Magic Pill. And I had heard about these anti-obesity drugs. And the thing I liked about this book, and a lot of the books that I've read on health, some of them are written by doctors, some of them by scientists, and some of them by journalists. And I actually find I really appreciate the books written by journalists, people who are investigating something, because they tend to be a little less biased. They tend to have a little less of an agenda. And they tend to be able to look more honestly at both sides than both scientists and doctors do. And so this book, The Magic Pill by Johann Hari, I really appreciated. He's a man who has struggled with his weight and obesity for much of his life. And during COVID, when some of these anti-obesity drugs came out, he began learning about them and decided he wanted to investigate them a little bit further. Now, before I go even further, I need to remind everybody, I'm not a doctor. I'm not trying to give you medical advice. I'm trying to let you in on how I process through the information I'm gathering. Your health decisions that you make for yourself need to be made in partnership with your family and loved ones and people you trust, as well as with people in the medical profession who you trust and who you can get sound advice from. So I need to be very clear. I'm not trying to tell you what you need to do with your health. I'm sharing with you how I've been filtering through the stuff I've been learning as I've thought about and taken some steps to begin changing my health. And so as Johann Hari began, he actually looked at the book, and I would highly recommend reading this book because he talks about how the way these anti-obesity drugs work is people just don't get hungry anymore. So they eat a lot less. And once you begin taking these pills, you get a much quicker sense of being full. And your calorie intake drastically decreases. And people tend to lose a lot of weight very quickly. And that has had a profound impact on a lot of people's lives. And he looks at this solution to the challenge of obesity from, I think, a fairly accurate or fairly fair viewpoint, where he talks about the benefits of people who have done everything they could do. They've gone on diets, they've exercised more, they've moved more, they've done everything they've been able to do, and they still are not at the weight they want to be. And for many people, they find taking these drugs allows them to lose weight they've never been able to lose and to keep it off, as long as they take the drug. The challenge that he investigates throughout this book is there are many reasons why people in our society struggle with obesity. And some of them are biological, and some of those problems can be fixed through, or at least the symptoms can be addressed through taking these types of pills. But a lot of obesity is caused by environmental problems, whether it's the food environment we live in, the processed foods that we eat, our access to food, or even our own psyche and our psychological situation that may cause us to eat or to have a misplaced relationship with our dietary intake. And so he's very clear that while these drugs give you a sense of being full and therefore reduce the amount of calories you take in, they don't change your diet. People don't go from eating hot dogs, hamburgers, and junk food and fast food and processed foods to eating salads and whole foods and drinking water instead of soda. That's not what happens. They just eat less of whatever they've been eating. And so it's not changing your diet. And the process works primarily while you're only taking the pill. And so a lot of people, once they come off the pill, the weight gain comes back because they haven't changed their food environment or addressed the challenges, the psychological challenges that they're in that may have caused them to have a dysfunctional relationship with food and with dietary intake. And then he has a whole discussion about what does it mean to take something indefinitely, where, again, the pill doesn't change your food environment and it doesn't change your relationship to food. It just changes how much you eat. It doesn't heal whatever psychological things it doesn't address the psychological situations that you're dealing with. It merely tempers your diet, your appetite. And he talks about they're not even sure where it affects you. Does it affect you primarily in your gut biome? Does it affect you in your mental, in your brain? And as he looked into it further and further, he realized the people developing these drugs, the people selling them, don't really know. They know the results of it, but they don't know why it's necessarily causing the changes that it's causing. And there's a lot of things unknown, and then they don't know what's going to happen, not just when you take this drug for 5 or 10 years, which they have some understanding of that. But if you start taking this drug in your 20s or 30s, right, you could be taking this drug for 40, 50, 60 years. And he looks even more closely at what happens if you start giving it to children. And now they're taking these drugs for 60, 70, 80 years of their lives. And he says, we don't know what the long-term implications of taking these drugs, of being on these drugs permanently, are going to do to our bodies and to our mental health and to all these other things, because he also talks about the drugs have a sense of tempering your emotions. And so he gives the book the issue a very balanced discussion. And he looks at it from both sides. He talks about why he's made the choices he made and the struggles and the dilemmas he had to wrestle through in making the choices that he made. And I actually really appreciated the book. I felt like it gave me some really good insight on how to think about these issues. And I do think that, yeah, it sounds like from the book there are many people that these kind of drugs can benefit. But if you begin taking them without understanding what's known and what's not known about these drugs and what they may and may not do, that can be a challenge. And I just want to share with you some of where this is seen, right? And so this is an article that came out on CNN, and this was last summer. It came out in July. They published this article that some of these popular weight loss drugs and diabetes drugs are linked to an increased risk of a rare form of blindness. And even just in the past few months now, they've done a few studies and they've been looking a bit more closely, and people don't actually know. They see the frequency, the rise in frequency of some of this blindness, but they don't necessarily know what's causing it or what's behind it. And again, I'm not trying to be an alarmist or to be a conspiracy theorist, but this goes back to some of the conclusions that Johann Hari made in his book, which is we don't know the long-term implications of taking these kind of drugs. We don't know all the impacts of what it does to our bodies and doesn't do to our bodies. And so there's a lot of unknowns and a lot of risk. And I think he treats the issue very fairly, but it shows how much we really have to think through and how we need to address these things. And I need to move along because I have to get going fairly soon. So I may have to do a part 2 to this and come back later and discuss the other books. But so anyway, so that's that book where I talk the magic pill. The next book I want to discuss is this book I just read, In Defense of Food. I'm almost done with it. I'm reading it. I have like another hour or two to read it or to finish reading it. But this is really a good book. And in the introduction, Michael Pollan gives his conclusion away. Eat more whole foods, mostly plants, and a little less meat. I forget exactly how he says it, but that's basically the conclusion. Eat more whole foods, mostly plants, and a little less meat. And I really appreciate the simplistic approach that Michael Pollan takes to the whole discussion of nutrition and diet in this book. And he brought up some really good things, which I'm going to put some more thought into. He goes into, and there's other books that do this too, he goes into basically the whole history of corn. And for many indigenous peoples, corn is sacred to us. It's a food source we've had. It was unique to the Americas. And it's one of the few traditional foods that colonists didn't destroy, right? Buffalo was also a very strong food for Native peoples, and in their attempt to eradicate us, they eradicated the buffalo. But they caught on to corn. And he goes through some of the history of corn and how essentially he talks about how corn has colonized people. When you look at it from an evolutionary standpoint, corn is now in almost everything we eat, and it dominates our caloric intake, and it's an incomplete carbohydrate, and we've turned it into this massively highly processed food, and it's one of the things that is literally destroying our health today. And so Western culture has taken this food that for centuries, even longer, was sacred to Native peoples, and they've turned it into a destructive processed food that is now linked to our massive rises in diabetes and obesity and metabolic health issues and other chronic diseases, whether it's through high fructose corn syrup or through just all the processing that, right? All of these things. And the book gives a very good discussion on some of the ways we need to think much more simply about eating. And one of the things I think the book lacks is it doesn't have a strong, it doesn't make a strong authoritative case. It talks about we need to eat like our mothers taught us, or our mothers' mothers would have taught us. And he gives many examples of how indigenous peoples have eaten well and not struggled with chronic diseases throughout the ages. But he doesn't use that, he doesn't have any voice of authority there. And I thought, yeah, I like his very simple argument. But it's a challenge when he doesn't counter the limits of reductionary science and what he calls nutritionalism with the full authority and the weight of the indigenous wisdom of what does it mean. And again, all of these books, they don't talk about what they learned from indigenous people. They talked about how they've observed indigenous peoples. Not what they taught them, but what they just observed by seeing how we ate or what diseases we had or didn't have. No one actually, and none of these books, no one sits down and has a conversation with indigenous peoples. They all just study us and poke us and prod us and take our blood and take our urine and sample this and sample that and draw conclusions. And no one sits down and just talks to us. What are your teachings about food? So In Defense of Food is a very good book. And I haven't quite finished it yet, but I highly recommend it. I'm reading another book by Michael Pollan called The Omnivore's Dilemma, which it follows 4 meals: a fast food meal, an organic meal, a farmer's market meal, and a hunted and gathered meal, back to its sources, and talks about the nutritional benefits and challenges of each of them. I'm still reading through that book, but it's a really good book. The last book I want to talk about, and I'm going to have to come back because I need to, unfortunately, run out and do, because I'm traveling tomorrow, I need to come back and I need to get a lot of stuff done today. And I thought I could get this done before I had to go, but I spent a bit too much time on the book, The Magic Pill, than I thought I was going to. But I really want to talk about the book, The End of Craving. And this book is fascinating. And this is a paradigm shifting book because it talks about, just one of the examples it gives is in the 1800s and early 1900s, there was an epidemic, a nutritional epidemic going around called pellagra, which comes from a lack of niacin. And people, especially in farming communities in the springs, were dying by the tens of thousands. He looks specifically at the populations of Italy and of the southern United States, where it was an epidemic in both places. And every year, people are dying from pellagra, which comes from a lack of niacin. Niacin is found in things like legumes. It's found in meats. It's found in some other nutrients or other foods. And in the early 1900s, when science began understanding more about vitamins and micronutrients, they realized that pellagra was caused by a lack of niacin. And so Italy and the US fixed their pellagra problem in 2 very different ways. Italy suggested to their population that they begin baking their breads communally. They suggested that they drink more wine, which is made with yeast, which has niacin in it, and raise more rabbits, which is a cheap source of meat. And over the next 5 to 10 years, they nearly got rid of their pellagra problem. The US fixed it overnight, literally, like within a year. And we fixed it by enriching our flour, our rice, and our pasta with niacin. We changed our food. And we fixed it overnight. Fast forward 70, 80, 90 years. The United States of America has an obesity rate of 40%. Italy has an obesity rate of about 14%. And the book is a discussion about how, because we've changed our food, not only enriching our flours, but changing the sweetness of beverages with artificial sweeteners, our bodies, which have over thousands, millions of years grown to understand when you taste something, when you see something, when you eat something, it knows what it's getting. Now it no longer has a clue what it's getting. And that's causing our bodies to react in different ways. And so it actually, he points to, this is probably one of our causes of so many of our metabolic and chronic diseases that we face as a nation. He goes into a very long discussion about how the uncertainty is what's behind some of our food addictions, and how that is even played out within actual addiction, whether it's an addiction to gambling or an addiction to drugs. But it's the same environment within our food environment. And I will come back. Unfortunately, I'm out of time right now. I will come back and talk more about the end of craving, because I think it is a very important discussion that we need to have. This book actually caused me to change my diet. I'm not going carb-free, but I'm working very hard to no longer eat enriched foods. I started buying unenriched flour, which is literally twice as much. If you buy all-purpose baking flour or all-purpose flour, white flour, that has niacin and riboflavin and everything else, and you'll pay anywhere from $2 to $4 for a 3 or 5 pound bag. To buy unenriched flour, the same bag is going to cost you twice as much. Any bread that you buy in the store will be made with enriched flour. Because of this, right, it's almost impossible to, it takes a lot of intentionality to not eat the enrichment. And what I found as I cut back on my enriched foods, I'm actually beginning to crave other foods. I actually crave things like legumes, beans, black beans, pinto beans, which are high in niacin. I'm hungry for them. I want to eat them. It's actually had an impact on the way that I eat and what I crave and what I feel hungry for. It's a fascinating journey that I'm still in the middle of beginning to understand. But again, when you combine the understanding that Mark gives in his book, Mark Schatzker gives in his book, The End of Craving, with the nutritionalism that Michael Pollan talks about in his book, In Defense of Food, you begin to see how much our reductionism science has colonized and convoluted our understanding of nutrition. It's jacked up our health, and it's made us lose touch with a very natural process of eating and of even responding in a healthy way to our cravings. This is fascinating stuff, my relatives. Anyway, I'm so grateful that we can have these types of discussions and we can talk about these things. Later this month on my Patreon, I'm going to actually give a more in-depth lecture on some of my decolonizing health content. It's going to be part of my Join the Conversation tier. If you want to follow me on that, I'm going to give it in about a week and a half before the end of the month. on my Patreon. I just put the link in for it there. I also want to share the link for people where you can buy signed copies of my book, Unsettling Truths. I'm doing everything I can to continue to teach common memory and to teach our history and to engage in these types of conversations. I use Patreon as a way to keep my voice independent, as well as to take the conversation even deeper. But my relatives, I deeply appreciate all of you. Thank you for joining me. I hope your second cup of coffee is as good as mine has been. Have a wonderful week. I will be active on social media as I'm traveling this week, and I look forward to sharing another second cup of coffee with you next week. Yeah, my relatives, walk in beauty, and may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. How going that?